Everyone, gather around the fire. It's about to start again. We begin, as all good things should, with a story. It is the story of an outcast and his deeds, both good and evil. You may at times feel the desire to brand him a villain, but things won't be so simple. This is the story of a god who tried and failed to become king, and in the process, learned what it means to believe. A baby is born, blue of complexion, into a cold world. He is still too young to understand and fear the sounds of war outside. They find him all the same. As his kin are driven from a palace made of ice, he is discovered by a warlord, a king, the enemy. Conquest has hardened this one-eyed man's heart, but this helpless child finds its way through. The warring is ended. As he grows into a man, the child who was adopted from a land of frost believes himself to be destined for greatness. He has been told as much by the people he thinks are his parents for all his life. His mother teaches him magic, and his father teaches him diplomacy and leadership. He teaches himself how to have a little fun. He is a fast talker, boastful, and cunning enough to back it up most of the time. He and his older brother spend their childhood playing, fighting, and competing for their father's approval. By all accounts, typical brotherly behavior. The boy who was prince has almost everything he could want, and as he continues to get older, he learns how to take what little he lacks. As the youngest, he has no direct claim to the throne, but that is simply a matter of proving that he is the better leader. Considering his brother's love for action without thought, it's almost too easy to trick him into making a big mistake. His rage is easy enough to aim, and with a peace treaty broken, his brother is banished. The boy who was now a man doesn't account for just one thing. He never imagined that he was adopted, that his claim to the throne and godhood itself was so very tenuous. His emotions get the better of him, and he finds himself overcompensating for this newfound insecurity. He acts like his brother, someone he knows has a right to the throne, and seeks out battle and conquest. It ends in failure. His brother returns, having learned humility from banishment, and the man is lost to the cosmos to stew on the lie that was his life. He reemerges a year later with a new power and a chip on his shoulder. The man has come to take what he believes to be his birthright, a throne. He brings war to Earth in the same way that his adopted father brought war to the man's home world. He is hoping to earn respect and glory by following in the footsteps of a king. Instead, he once again finds nothing but failure and disappointment. The world he would rule stands united against him, and with the aid of his own brother, they defeat him and his army. He returns to home, not on a chariot to celebrate his victory, but in chains to affirm his loss. The next several years are a blur of ups and downs. He is imprisoned in his own home for a short time before invaders come to attack those he has come to despise. He betrays his family and pays for it dearly when, instead of losing his father or brother to the battle, he loses his dear mother, the only person who continued to believe in him. His shared grief is enough to earn the temporary trust of his brother. Together they find those who attack their home and get their revenge. The man takes advantage of the turmoil and fakes his death. While his brother finishes the fight elsewhere, the man returns home in disguise and takes the throne as a false king. He enjoys the spoils of being a king for some time. He commissions statues and plays in his honor, and revels in the throne he dreamt of for so long. His hedonistic delights do much to appease the people of his home, but the remaining worlds suffer in the absence of the old king. Everything the man built comes crumbling down when his brother returns home. He sees through the facade and forces the man to return their father to his rightful place as king. The search is short and less than fruitful. They find their father only in time to lose him for good. Another family secret is exposed, and their older sister returns home to claim her throne. The brothers learn slowly and begrudgingly to trust each other again, and together they save their people at the cost of their home world. Riding high on their victory, the man is finally at peace with his brother's place as the rightful heir and king. For the first time since he was a child, the man has hope. His losing streak has seemingly ended. It should come as no surprise that the man's joy could not last. It may shock you to know that it took less than a week. Another warlord bent on destruction and godhood finds the man. He is no longer a baby, no longer defenseless. The man fights back against a dark reflection of the warrior who adopted him. A minute later, the man falls to the floor, lifeless. His final failure. This may sound like an ending, but for our purposes, it is a necessary beginning. We need to know the planned trajectory of this man's life before we can understand how just one moment can change it. In the distant past, a conflict is taking place which will allow the man to change his story. He stoops down to take his life into his own hands. Even the Norns cannot see where fate leads him now. The man's name is Loki Laufeyson, Prince of Asgard and God of Mischief. He is about to learn that his entire life has been a story. This is not the only way to tell this story. Myth is almost always at its best when told so many times that it's no longer possible to untangle the web of contradictions and changes. It's somehow more human for our stories not to align perfectly. There is a poetry to the inconsistency. It speaks to generations of adjustment and progress. What once started as just a simple moral or lesson has been touched by too many lives to be so obvious anymore. Each story carries on its shoulders the intentions and proclivities of the thousands who told it before you. The tangle is not one of confusion, but a perspective made too obvious to ignore. It is evidence of a people and a culture in a way that a singular writer could never achieve. Marvel's version of Loki is yet another addition to that canon of conflicting stories. The Norse god has seen his fair share of rewrites in the comics and films alone. The Shakespearean Loki of the first Thor film is hardly recognizable by the time we reach Ragnarok, but they're both valid interpretations that are necessary to tell those particular stories. It's this contradictory position in the world that makes the Loki from the Disney Plus show of the same name the most interesting version of the character. The show isn't just concerned with who he is for that story. It's concerned with everything he was and everything he could be. In that spirit, we can't just talk about a singular archetypical Loki anymore. We need to see at least some of the perspectives that made him so that we can understand this character known for wielding so many faces and how the show uses his story to its greatest potential. Oh, and in case you couldn't tell, this one's going to be about the Loki show, so there will be spoilers for all of it. If you haven't watched the show yet, you probably should. It's definitely worth your time, and I can only burn so much runtime on recaps. Now let's talk about Loki the Devil. The first Loki we meet, and the one most of us are familiar with, is the antagonist. This Loki is best known for his pride and envy. He seeks a throne, power, and respect, and he is denied it every time. The irony of this Loki's existence is that the more he tries to take what he thinks he wants, the less he gets what he really needs. Less irony and more just how it usually goes, I guess. In the show, Loki and his variants are compared to the devil on multiple occasions. It's clear that to most people, Loki represents the same temptations that the devil does. He's hedonistic, and his idea of fun is making other people's lives harder. In the myths, Loki's daughter is literally named Hel, and for exactly the reasons you would expect. In the Avengers, Loki's most narratively important power is that he can turn the hearts of good people to his own desires. He uses trickery and temptation to deceive people into working against their own best interest. I mean, he literally wears 2 giant horns on his head. How much more obvious do we need to get here? This is the Loki of the Avengers, and it's the one that we start with at the beginning of the show. This is him at his lowest moment, but he thinks it's him at his greatest. He is still under his own illusion of grandeur. This Loki is the devil because he thinks he deserves to be God. Normally it's supposed to take years for Loki to work his way out of this mindset, but in Dr. Mobius's time theater of personal trauma, we can fast-track that journey just a little bit. Loki literally gets to see his life from the outside and reflect on what he was and what he would have become. The whole first episode is just a messed up therapy session, honestly. Guys will literally watch the most impactful and transformative moments in their life on a slideshow projector instead of going to therapy. The big breakthrough after all that is that Loki isn't the devil. He never really was. He didn't think he was God, but he was afraid that if he was anything less, he would be unable to be loved.
I don't enjoy hurting people. I don't enjoy it. I do it because I have to, because I've had to, because it's part of the illusion.
So if the devil was just an illusion he cast, the next Loki we should examine is the one behind the illusions, the magician, the trickster. Let's take a look at Loki, the god of mischief. Mischief is an interesting domain for a god. Most gods tend to be personified forces of nature or highly valued traits, but even in this, Loki finds himself quite the outcast. In practice, it seems that being a god of mischief is mostly about getting into and back out of very convoluted predicaments. Loki is that guy who's always in the middle of the ocean on a snap map. He's the guy who promises he's not going to get too drunk tonight and then walks back into the room blacked out 30 minutes later. While his brother is a lovable buffoon, Loki is a lovable rogue. He does everything in his power to make you wonder why you still keep him around, and then at the last possible second, he comes in clutch. The show does a very good job of playing to his strengths in this way. I thought about making a list of all the different ways that Loki exemplifies mischief in the show, but we really only need to talk about one scene here. The salad apocalypse. I told you, if you haven't watched the show yet, you're going to be confused on this one. Loki could have made this explanation a simple bit of exposition and moved on, but that's not who Loki is. Unnecessary theatrics are part of his charm. He's cunning enough to find a loophole in the TVA security and petty enough to punish Mobius for giving him desk work at the same time. It's peak mischievous scamp. Plus, he manages to use his theory as an excuse to go see Pompeii live.
But if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like nothing changed at all?
There's still the god part to contend with, though. Mostly his company seems to do the heavy lifting with that title. I mean, his dad is the Allfather, and his brother can change the weather at will. A couple of pranks and getting day drunk doesn't necessarily sound godly by comparison. Where Loki really earns his stripes is his magic. Loki's relationship with magic is extremely important. Important enough that I learned how to do that trick just for this bit. But sadly, it gets shafted in most of the movies. We rarely see more from him than the occasional duplication casting or disguised self, but the show once again delivers in spades. One of my favorite moments that's really easy to overlook in the grand scheme of things comes in Season 1, Episode 2. Mobius calls the fake doubles that Loki's been casting since the original Thor movie illusion projections, and Loki takes it really personally. He completely derails the conversation to emphasize the fact that what he's doing is actually called duplication casting, and it's much harder than a simple illusion projection. I mean, look at how upset he's getting here. It's completely adorable the way he wants them to get this right and also give him the proper credit.
Duplication casting entails recreating an exact facsimile of one's own body in its present circumstance. Illusion projection involves depicting a detailed image from outside oneself which is perceptible in the external world. But you already knew that.
The easy explanation for this tirade is that Loki's just trying to prove he's the better variant, but I think it's a bit more complicated than that. The show goes to great lengths to try to tie his magic directly to his relationship with his mother. It's the kind of choice that retroactively improves everything that came before it. Every fight he wins with his wits and a clever placement of a duplicate is now an expression of the time he spent learning with his mother. It's a reminder of her promise that he could be whatever he set his mind to. Even when his mind is set on the wrong things, it's his mother's words that give him the strength to persist past every failure. So when he takes pains to explain his magic, it's not just another moment of narcissistic pride. He's defending something special he shared with his mom. His mama didn't raise some hack who can only cast illusion projections. She raised someone capable of replicating himself down to every minuscule detail. His mother shouldn't get all the credit for his godly ways, though. His father had his own twisted hand in this mess. Glorious purpose is not a subtle theme in any Loki project from the Avengers onwards. He says the word a lot, and it's the title of 2 different episodes in the show. So what's up with that? Glorious purpose. It's a funny phrase to use, right? What's this guy who prides diplomacy over brute force doing chasing after glory in battle and autocratic leadership anyway? Well, I'm no psychologist, but it might be slightly tied to that dad he's trying to impress. Let's not mince words here. Odin became the ruler of the 9 realms through bloodshed and battle, even in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as PG-13 as it tries to be. Sure, the Iron Man movies might have been loosely about the military-industrial complex, but the Thor movies were just an inch away from being about colonialism. The real difference between Thor and Loki is that Thor was too brash and got himself banished, but Loki was actually clever enough to get away with half a genocide. Thor's slap on the hand taught him humility, but Loki didn't get a Jane Foster to teach him what it means to be something other than a god. This is what it really means to be the god of mischief. Cunning enough to get away with whatever you want, but perpetually stuck dealing with the consequences of your actions. Smart enough to know better, bored enough to do it anyway. A house cat with magical powers. So if the god hides behind the veneer of a devil, what is it that's hiding underneath this semi-edible complex that represents the god? What are Loki's constant claims to godhood an attempt to overcome? This is where the TVA really comes in. They expose Loki the fiction. What makes Loki a Loki? With all these variants around, it's a good question to ask. When you meet an alligator wearing a crown just like yours that claims to be you, it's probably time to take stock of what you even means anymore. According to our brief history lesson in the first episode of the show, the Sacred Timeline cast Loki as the devil because it needed the Avengers to form. Loki's written as the antagonistic force that drives those 6 people to become a team. The clever trick of the TVA is that it's a simple and not at all subtle excuse to talk about Loki on a metatextual level. A gentle hand isn't always best anyway. Sometimes it's more efficient to just whack the audience across the face with a metaphor and get on with it. This way, we can admit that the Avengers is a fiction without removing ourselves from the world. The whole framing device allows Loki to contend with who he really is and whether he actually wants to stay that way. Is he really a static villain, or was he just pruned anytime he tried to be anything more dynamic? The best way to find out is to meet the Lokis who went off script. Classic Loki is a reflective man caught up in the past. When a gang of Lokis refuse to grow and instead continue their grasp at power for power's sake, he just says that Lokis are fundamentally broken. After a lifetime of living alone in a cave, thinking about all his various failures and mistakes, it's easy to see why he might have abandoned hope that they can be anything more. Kid Loki doesn't disagree that Lokis are broken, but as all good kids do, he has hope that things can change. His frustration lies not with the archetype of Loki, but with the TVA, an organization that prunes any Loki that attempts to transcend it and become something greater. I mean, his transcendent moment was killing his brother, but hey, growth comes to us all in different ways. Who am I to judge a little murderer? Boastful Loki, President Loki, and pretty much everyone else we see in the Void is a reinforcement that Loki truly is just static. They posit that maybe the TVA has nothing to do with it. Maybe Loki is just too vain and arrogant to learn from his mistakes. Perhaps the pampered prince is all he can be without a drastic shift in his lived experiences. After all, the biggest departures we meet are an older man, a child, and a woman. 3 things that most Loki variants are not. Which means we should probably finally mention Sylvie in earnest, the Loki that breaks every mold. She isn't concerned with a throne or betraying others for the fun of it. She just wants to tear the TVA down, burn the splinters, and wash it all away. Sylvie is a catalyst of sorts for our main Loki variant. She represents the change that Lokis are capable of. She impresses Loki despite himself, and by the end of it all, she is the inspiration for his hardest decision. Finally, we are left with our Loki. His Nexus event comes so late into his development as the villain that we can directly use him as a barometer for this nature versus nurture question the show wants to ask. The show's overall arc is just a question of whether our beloved God of Mischief can overcome his nature with the aid of his friends. He's finally getting his very own Jane Foster, and it's actually a crew of like 4 or 5 office workers. By the end of the show, it's pretty clear that the final verdict is that Loki was always capable of more in every category. He can be more villainous, as exemplified by the Loki gang in the Void, but he can also be more caring, trusting, and even godly. And it all starts in episode 1, when he tells Mobius he's a villain. The second Mobius doubts the story Loki has been telling himself, he realizes that he can be something more.
You do know yourself.
A villain. That's not how I see it.
So what makes a Loki a Loki? The show gives us a few direct answers.
What exactly makes a Loki a Loki?
Independence, authority, style.
Do you think that what makes a Loki is the fact that we're destined to lose?
We may lose, but we don't die. We survive.
What really makes a Loki is hope. No matter how many times they fail, no matter how often the odds are stacked against them, Lokis are looking for the out. No adversity is too great, and no power is too intimidating. When Loki's in his villain era, the hope is certainly misplaced, but you can't deny that there are not many others who would look the Hulk in his face one-on-one and yell at him.
I am a god, you dull creature, and I will not be bullied by that.
So when Sylvie tells him that they're always destined to lose, she's partially right. But Lokis aren't defined by their failures. They're defined by how they react to them. Always another plan, always another angle. Conflict, and the failure that comes with it, is the core to most fiction. It doesn't always come in the form of a fight, but there is always an obstacle. Lokis are usually defined by having protagonist energy and pointing it towards antagonistic ends. The show gives Loki a chance to finally see what he can do when he actually gets to be the protagonist. And that leaves us with one last layer that we need to discuss. Loki the show took the time to peel back the previous ones for us. They debunk the illusion of the devil, they take away his magic and sense of godlike power, and they reveal to him his fiction. All that's left for the rest of the show is Loki the man. Loki's place as a god is a bit contentious from the start. Even in the myth, Loki isn't one of the gods of Asgard. He's the son of a giant who just lives in Asgard because he's best bros with Odin. When someone calls Zeus a god, it's easy to understand how someone could see a lightning storm and think that God is mad at them, but what were Viking pranks like that they felt like they were being punished by a god?
Sorry I'm late, everyone. It's very rude of me. Oh my God, I'm hard. Could you excuse me for a second? I have to figure out what's going on. What the heck? There's a pink bag on my chair?
It's a prank.
On me?
No, it's just a joke.
What's the joke exactly? That I had a milder fart than I normally do? Because that's pretty funny, actually.
When Loki speaks with Odin in Thor the Dark World, he tells him that human life shouldn't matter because they are gods. Odin disapproves of this framing and responds that no, they aren't gods. They are born and they can die, just like any other being. While Loki is quick to point out that thousands of years of life is effectively immortality, it doesn't change the fact that Odin has a point. The people of Asgard have more in common with Tolkien's elves than they do the typical godly archetype, and that leaves us more room to give Loki some humanity. In the TVA, where even Infinity Stones wield no power, a god can just be a man. It gives the audience something to latch onto. We aren't watching the struggles of a god prince. We're watching a man who has lived a few thousand years get humbled and reminded that he is not all-powerful or all-knowing. Just another guy with an unfulfilling office job. There is no better way to win the empathy of an audience than placing someone in a sea of cubicles and office bureaucracy. Loki might have started this journey a little twerp, but that's nothing a stint in the labor force can't straighten out. Loki the man skims work training videos. He heads to the break room with coworkers after hours of putting his nose to the grindstone. He digs through mountains of paperwork and argues with his team on the best strategy for completing the project. He wears a button-up, slacks, and a tie. The god dreamed of a throne, but the man dreams of climbing the corporate ladder to become the new CEO, the timekeeper. That isn't the only place we can see his humanity, though. Loki has always been characterized as the more artsy of the Odinson brothers, and with an appreciation of the arts comes a soul. Art is a human endeavor, something that requires a person to imbue it with meaning and purpose. The difference between kicking over a can of paint and art is intent. It's the same difference that separates a cat running across a piano and jazz. A grocery list and a poem are only divided so long as you believe that the grocery list has no deeper meaning. Loki spends his time disguised as Odin, commissioning art. It might be vain art, but the human intent is there all the same. Loki doesn't build a statue of himself or commission a play about his noble sacrifice just for the fun of it. He does it for legacy. That's not the action of an immortal god. So we finally see who Loki is at his core. When everything is untangled, he's just one of us, a man. It makes sense in its own way. The Norse follow a common tradition of making your deities flawed in a very human way. The gods weren't perfect heroes, they were just us, but more. Here's the big kicker. The Norse gods existed to give a face to the things that people thought were worthy of worship. But if the gods are just people too, who is it they're supposed to believe in? In Loki's case, we start the show with nothing. He believes at most in himself, his self-proclaimed right to rule over all others, but that's hardly a god. He admits that this whole persona is just an illusion, so under it we see there is no guiding force. Loki appears like a god to us, but the man underneath it all has nothing to believe in. He is an atheist god. This is what drew me to the show originally. When I started watching it, I couldn't help but feel like what Loki was going through was a religious experience. At first, I felt like maybe this was just a side effect of the religious undertones throughout the show. But the more I dug into what it really means to have a religious experience, the more it seemed to corroborate my initial reaction. Loki is a show about one god's conversion from atheist to believer. I won't deny, it probably sounds pretty outlandish, but you've come this far, right? You've got to be at least a little curious to see where we're going next. With the thesis statement finally out of the way, we can get to the fun part of today, trying to define religious experience, featuring William James. Okay, first things first, I read a book. It was an old book, and it was a long book, but I read it anyway. Already off to a bad start, I know. YouTube isn't about books, it's about visual media that I can put on the screen so that you don't have to stare at my face all day. Unfortunately for us, it was a really good book, so we're going to have to talk about it anyway. The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James is quite the undertaking. He sets out to define a generic idea of what religion is, and then use that to reverse engineer the purpose of all religious experiences. Even though he is decidedly Christian, he's also a pragmatist, which means he's less worried about proving why Christianity is right and more concerned with figuring out why it seems to work for him. If you're unfamiliar with pragmatism, you're not much different than most pragmatists, honestly. It's a philosophy that loosely works with the idea that the truth is whatever works best in the long term. So for William James, the question isn't, is religion real or true? The question is it somehow useful to believe in the divine? That question resonated with me because it mirrors a lot of the themes of Loki. He struggles throughout the series to figure out what he wants, what he believes in, and whether any of it is still useful to him. In many ways, he's like someone who's lost their faith, searching again for some hint of the divine. All that is to say that we won't be talking specifically about Christianity here, although I will dip into it frequently for examples, since it's what I and William James are most familiar with. The whole idea of finding a generic definition is to completely sidestep the bickering over details. Humanity is clearly drawn to religion for some reason, regardless of its trappings. What is that reason? If I could answer that question with ease, we wouldn't need to ask it, so let's take a step back and start from the beginning. I keep mentioning the divine, so let's try to define that. According to William James, the divine shall mean for us only such a primal reality as the individual feels impelled to respond to solemnly and gravely, and neither by a curse nor a jest. The divine is subconscious. It's something that you feel rather than see. It has a pull to it that requires you to give it a level of respect. The awe you feel looking out into nature, the amazement you feel when witnessing the great expanses of space, the swell of emotion you feel when you're reconnected with an old friend. All of these are experiences of the divine. The fact that people have an uncontrollable reaction to these things isn't inherently proof that the divine is real, but it is proof that it's a human experience. Pragmatically speaking, that's all we need to move forward. For most of humanity, the primal reality that we label as divine is true. Religious experience, then, is an interaction with that divine reality. If that seems a little vague, then congratulations, you've discovered the side effects of creating a generic definition. You have to start adding in details if you want specifics, and details will start to leave people out. It doesn't take much to see how we could flesh out this definition, though. Take prayer, for example. It's a solemn attempt to commune with the divine force by projecting your thoughts out into the ether. Meditation can be a cousin of this practice. Both are solemn in the sense that they are intent and focused. You don't have to sound depressed to be considered praying, but you do have to be focused on reaching out to a divine presence that you've felt. What makes an experience religious is the intent to interface with something beyond yourself. With those definitions out of the way and just generic enough to be frustrating, we can finally get down to the big question. Why do humans constantly seek out religious experiences? Across time and location, it's been one of our most consistent pursuits. So what's the purpose for it? According to James, there are two main camps that people fall into: healthy-minded and morbid-minded. It might already seem like you know which group you'd want to be in, but I promise it's not as clear-cut as it sounds. We'll start our discussion with the healthy-minded because I said so. The healthy-minded are people who completely avert their attention from evil. There are different levels of denial, but most of them believe that evil is somewhat real, just too far outside of our control to bother with. The healthy-minded person focuses instead on the good of the world. Their interactions with the divine are intended to support the belief that evil isn't worth worrying over. There is a force outside of everything, and when you're in its presence, everything is good. The attitude is typically less evil isn't real and more it has no power here. Evil will never triumph, and in fact, it can never triumph. The divine is just too good for evil to ever be part of the equation. The elephant in the room is that this is a very fragile mindset to maintain. You have to be naive, beyond optimistic, or extraordinarily lucky and privileged to live a life that makes ignoring the evils of the world consistently possible. It's the religious equivalent to a rich kid complaining that no one knows how to work hard anymore. This leaves us with the much more common morbidly minded folk. The morbid-minded are not just aware of evil in the world, they're usually a little too aware of it. They've suffered loss and seemingly pointless struggle, despite the fact that they've also felt that pull of the divine. It's the result of two realities that seem hard to reconcile: a primal reality and our objective reality. The primal reality pulls you toward it, but no matter how many times you can feel it in your bones, you keep waking up back here in our world. A common example is someone who dedicated their life to God becoming an atheist because they lost someone they love. It can feel impossible to suffer through such conscious pain and still find that unconscious sense of good you once had. It becomes unbelievable. The biggest difference between the healthy and morbid-minded individual is experience. It's a lot like suffering through trauma. When you come face to face with evil in the world, you can't ignore its presence any longer. You have to adapt your previous beliefs to account for the fact that the evil you experienced has become an unavoidable part of who you are now. For many freshly morbid-minded people, this becomes irreconcilable with the divine, and they lose their faith entirely. The suffering cluttering their consciousness becomes like TV static, blocking out any chance for the subconscious world to break back in. Morbid-mindedness isn't just about losing faith in the divine, though. William James considers himself to be both a Christian and morbid-minded. The secret is that on the other side of all the pain is an even more intimate relationship with religious experiences. When you're healthy-minded, there is no evil to account for, so your experience of the divine is less special. If your idea of the world is just different from objective reality, it becomes hard to appreciate this unique, separate experience that you seem so in touch with. Morbid-minded individuals have no such issue. When someone has experienced a deep loss that seems like it will never leave, the sudden return of the divine experience can be ecstatic. Many people have described it as a wave of calm, peace, or even joy washing over them. William James believes that the morbid-minded are the ones who have a stronger philosophy. The healthy-minded may seem to be happy more often, but it comes at the expense of refusing to account for a genuine portion of our reality. As he says in the book, "It seems to me that we are bound to say that morbid-mindedness ranges over the wider scale of experience." This is all easy enough to say in theory, but if I really want to convey the morbid-minded experience, you need to hear another story. We are almost all born healthy-minded individuals. While we are young, we are guarded from evil through intentional protection or simple naivete. It allows us to freely experience the wonder of existing in this world. Once we've grown older and evil begins to seep in, we lose some semblance of touch with the divine. The conscious becomes our focus, and religious experience turns into something that requires effort to maintain. And then, something terrible happens. What it is isn't important, only that it inevitably happens to us all. Loss, pain, suffering, like none you've known before. The divine is blocked out entirely, and you are left to fend for yourself for the first time in your life. Time passes slowly, achingly slowly. Your body feels unbearably dense, like gravity has been wrenched up 1,000 times while you were sleeping. That is, if you've been able to sleep at all. More likely, you lay awake and stare at the ceiling. There is no peace to be found in your dreams. When you're lucky, no dreams come at all. When you're unlucky, you wake up screaming, throwing yourself from the bed in a misguided hope that you can run from the nightmares. The worst of all is waking up from the pleasant dreams. It makes the world you wake up into all the harder to bear. Each day becomes a checklist. Wake up. Get dressed as best you can. Go to school or work. Go home. Try to distract yourself until you can't hold your eyes open any longer. The rhythm doesn't make it any easier, but it alleviates the need to think. Your mind is too numb for that. As time passes, the checklist becomes easier to complete. Your mind thaws from the paralysis that always attends with shock, and you are able to accommodate changes. They're small at first, but they're there. Eventually, you can make bigger and bigger departures from the structures you've built until you're suddenly back into the patterns of your old life. On the inside, you've been altered forever, but it's comforting to return to familiar rhythms at least. As your guard begins to slip, you start to feel safe. Maybe you're just walking in a park, or driving down the road during a sunset, or going to church because your mom begged you to. But something happens. You feel the divine return to you, unbidden. Suddenly, you feel a part of a world that is bigger than you again. The pain is still there, but it's just a small thing compared to the immensity of it all. Just a piece of a much larger puzzle. You're not scared of being little anymore. You're just glad to be part of something more than suffering. It allows you to focus on better things. You find purpose again, and with it, you can finally move forward from it all. Your outside has changed to match the inside, but that doesn't seem like such a bad thing anymore. With even more time, you come to prefer who you've become. Religious experience has made you a part of something greater. So that's the reason. Religious experience is about connecting to a world outside of ourselves. It's about relationships and community. We find others who feel the same way, and together, we make that feeling a reality. That journey from an individual to a dedicated member of a community is the exact arc of the show Loki. Let's see if I can convince the one person who stuck around this long, starting with Season 1 and the fear of God. Come on. What did you expect? Did you think I grew my hair out this long for no reason? Every single choice I make is completely planned and layered. You can't even begin to imagine how many steps ahead I am at all times. We start the show off with a bang. If you haven't seen Avengers Endgame, you're probably not interested in the show, but the writers extend an olive branch anyway. Loki's fate after he escaped during the time heist is one of the biggest mysteries left open by a movie otherwise concerned with tying off loose ends, so there's a lot of weight that comes with answering that question. After a brief stint in the desert, he is immediately found by a bunch of time cops calling themselves the TVA, and in case you thought they were playing around, one of them hits Loki with the old slow-mo smack. It's a pretty fun visual gag. I'm shocked it never comes back. This is actually one of the first recurring themes in the show across both seasons. The TVA doesn't just watch over the timeline, they constantly find new and disturbing ways to use their control over time for the sake of torture. In a religious reading of this show, the TVA is a pretty clear stand-in for the church, so the fact that there is a considerable emphasis on the ways it uses its connection with the divine for torture is probably important. The members of the TVA in Season 1 view themselves as the righteous hand of a vengeful god. We'll see in time where this crusade leads them, but I think one of the most jarring things about the TVA's introduction is just how brutal it is right out the gate. Loki has certainly been a bad guy, but the way they immediately abuse and degrade him in the name of bureaucracy paints them in a bad light. Everything we see about this place is meant to strip away all the layers of Loki that he has built up until all that remains is the man. He has his ability to move freely taken by a seemingly bored jailer, then he is stripped naked, shown every word he's ever spoken, and subjected to an existential crisis. The moment where he's asked to walk through the metal detector is actually very telling. Every other display by the TVA so far has been met with a classic level of Loki sarcasm, but when he's told that he will melt from the inside out if he doesn't have a soul, he takes it extremely seriously. Loki can't help but worry that he might not have a soul. The thought seems to really get under his skin in a way that very little ever does, even in this show. After that, he watches a man be dissolved at the atomic level over an inconsequential breach of protocol, and then he learns that magic is powerless there, meaning he is powerless. Just when it seems like things can't get worse, he's shown that his entire life was written down to the second, and he was never meant to be the hero. His story was never actually his story.
You ridiculous bureaucrats will not dictate how my story ends.
It's not your story, Mr. Laufeyson. It never was.
In a last-ditch attempt to claim some free will, he uses the TVA's control of time against them, and he even manages to outsmart his pursuers long enough to get his hand on the Tesseract. All that just to find out that even Infinity Stones have no power in this realm. What you see in his eyes after that is the fear of God, plain and simple. For just a moment, he sees that there's a force outside of his control that is so great that he can't even comprehend it, and it scares the hell out of him.
Is this the greatest power in the universe?
After a brief return to the slide projector of his life to learn that he would one day receive validation, love, and even forgiveness from his family, he skips to the last thing that there is to learn: how it was supposed to end. As he watches himself fail one final time, he is almost unable to cope with the fact that Odin was right. They aren't gods. They're born, and as he was supposed to learn just a few years from now, they can absolutely die. He never reached his glorious purpose. Even in death, he's just a moment in someone else's story. The first episode of Loki is metatextual not because it wants to break the fourth wall, but because it's interested in a very specific question. Admit that everything before this was written, and that Loki is just an antagonist designed for the personal growth of others. What is he capable of when you give him a chance to be more than that? The second episode immediately starts to answer this question. Loki has become a lukewarm convert to the TVA's bureaucratic dogma. He wears the clothes and he follows the protocols, but he's still more than willing to ask questions and even mock some of the wilder beliefs. We'll call him agnostic at this point. Just listen to this wishy-washy explanation of his philosophy.
You see, I know something children don't.
What's that?
That no one bad is ever truly bad, and no one good is ever truly good.
Despite Mobius's best attempts, Loki isn't convinced that the Timekeepers are all they claim to be. Just because he has felt a force outside of himself doesn't mean he will automatically buy into the social rules that have been built up around it. The dogma is ancillary. It is not mandatory for belief. The working relationship between Mobius and Loki is his main source of contact with the divine so far. So he humors Mobius's preaching in the hopes that it will lead him to more experiences of this greater force. I mean, relationships with others are usually a way to encounter God's presence, but in this case, Mobius has literally promised that working well with him will get Loki an audience with the Trinity. No conversation is a clean break, though, and when Loki is tempted by a variant of himself, one who has already been compared to the devil earlier in the show, he leaves Mobius behind to chase after a more selfish pursuit of power. Mobius's cries aren't enough to keep Loki from relapsing into his more individualistic understanding of the world. Episode 3 literally puts Loki into conversation with himself. His relapse led to yet another failure, and getting stranded in the apocalypse with no clear way out is a pretty good chance to reflect on yourself and what went wrong. Welcome to the Rapture. Sylvie is here to show Loki what he could have been if the Timekeepers had never intervened. While she certainly isn't perfect, she's also far more concerned with things outside of herself. She bemoans Loki's inability to take things seriously. She wants him to become more solemn and focused. Sylvie is on the other side of the horseshoe from Mobius. They both believe in the power of the Timekeepers, but where Mobius respects and follows their lead, Sylvie has some notes. She provides Loki with validation for his distrust of the higher powers. Just because you believe in that thing you're feeling doesn't mean everything you hear about it is good or true. Sylvie is our Loki Martin Luther, but instead of hammering her 95 theses onto the church door, she's trying to hammer her machete into the foreheads of the 3 magic lizards who control the flow of time. Different strokes for different folks, I guess. The relationship between the two variants throughout this episode serves as more than just an allegory for the Protestant Reformation. It also works as a very subtle metaphor for self-acceptance. Very subtle compared to Scott Pilgrim, at least.
I want to fight you for me.
Scattering the power of self-respect.
This episode is fast-tracking the enemies to Lover's Ark and then riding that bitch like a sine wave. We can never get comfortable for more than a second before one of them is set off by a small quirk and they're back at each other's throats. There are a couple of ways to read this disconnect between the two variants. One is to see it on the surface as two people arguing, simple as that. The more interesting reading is to see it as two parts of Loki coming into conflict with themselves to see which will come out on top. Sylvie is the ideal, the spirit, the action. Loki is the actual, the flesh, the intent. The two halves are required to become whole. There are two wolves inside of you, and both of them are apparently bi. Good for them. The drinking car is where we finally get some time to let Loki reflect on his life since he learned that it was all orchestrated before he was ever born. He and Sylvie swap stories of their childhoods, and Loki is reminded of a time when he was healthy-minded and not nearly so bitter with his family. He tries to cope with this by drinking it away, but in his drunken state, the homesickness breaks through even more. He yearns for home and the assurances it used to bring. In his morbid state, he wishes he could just go back to simpler times, but it's not so easy. Instead, he unconsciously invokes art to reach the divine again. The conversation continues to return to an attempt to find the right analogy to explain love. They say love is hate, mischief, and an imaginary dagger, but none seem to fit. Love stumps them despite centuries of attempts to find it because neither of them have learned how to love themselves. Their frustrations with each other only serve to solidify this point. It is only by working together and getting small glimpses into each other's lives that they start to see that there is something to like about themselves. They learn to trust and rely on each other, and that trust allows Loki to see for the second time that there is a power in working towards something greater than himself. And then their plan blows up in their faces. By the way, the ship leaving Lamentis 1 was called the Ark, just in case you thought I was going to miss one of the obvious Bible references. The planet Lamentis itself is also likely a reference to the Book of Lamentations, which also revolves around the destruction of an entire place. The connections are everywhere once you start looking for them. The fourth episode introduced us to one of the messier sides of the TVA's terrible tactics. If you didn't already see how much emotional torture they put Variants through, then watching Sylvie go through the same things Loki did as a child will probably hammer this home. Seeing the depressingly small stack of papers comprising everything she's ever said is absolutely devastating. More than ever, we can recognize that the Church of the TVA is more concerned with sticking to their rules than considering what they're doing. Back on Lamentis, we get the emotional climax of Loki's journey to trust himself. The two variants consider their place in the universe and whether they were always destined to fail. They share a tender moment together, and it manages to create a nexus event despite the apocalypse that is coming to wipe everything out. This is pretty incredible considering they don't just make a deviation, they create a branch so extreme that experienced members of the TVA have never seen anything like it before. Loki learning to love himself and accept that he is not alone in the world is a big threat to the TVA. These two people finding comfort in each other is considered a break from the sacred timeline so severe that it doesn't even matter that they're about to die. The TVA needs to put an end to it as soon as humanly possible. If you didn't think the TVA was the old church before, hopefully you can see it by now. The punishment that Loki receives for falling out of line with the TVA is our newest entry into the 101 top ways to use time to torture someone. Loki is locked in a time loop of an embarrassing and painful moment from his past. Just like in the myths, Loki got drunk and cut off some of Sif's precious hair just because it sounded like some fun. And just like in the myths, his fun lasts for all of 10 seconds before he reaps what he has sown. Sif marches in, punches him, and tells him that he will always be alone. Loki was ripped away from a budding belief that he can be safe and happy with other people, just for the TVA to drop him in an endless reminder of why he thought he deserved to be alone forever in the first place. In this time loop prison, Loki attempts to perform the sacrament of reconciliation and serve his penance for his past sins. He tries to explain himself, but accepts the pain and humiliation each time that Sif returns with no knowledge of his previous attempts to apologize to her. His mistake is that each time he tries to change the past. No matter how many times he relives the same moment, he keeps searching for a version that would allow him to make peace with his actions, but the past has already gone by. No amount of regret will change how it ended. A punch to the gut, and an insult that cuts sharper than the blade that removed Sif's hair. After serving his enforced penance, Loki is finally able to get some sense past all the dogma. Even if they aren't willing to admit it, the people working at the TVA can sense that something is wrong. All the rules that are supposedly making the divine more available suddenly seem to clash with the subconscious thought that there's a deeper lie here. When Loki and Sylvie tell Mobius and B-15 respectively that they're just variants that were stolen from the timeline, we can see the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. Once deceit and corruption are revealed within the church, the dogma loses all sense of power and authority. All that's left is to stop the Crusades and start to set things right. Unfortunately for Mobius, Pope Renslayer doesn't take kindly to heresy, and she promptly orders him to be excommunicated via a one-way ticket to purgatory. More on that place later. For now, the Pope brings the supposed devils to an audience with the Trinity. There appears to have been a mix-up, though, because instead of executing the variants, a timekeeper loses his head, and it becomes abundantly clear that the TVA was serving androids, not gods. Literally just following protocols. Loki tries to take the moment of shock and confusion to be vulnerable. Between his search for forgiveness in time jail and getting a few affirmations that he is worthy of friendship from Mobius, he's ready to admit his feelings to Sylvie. But instead, he is also sent to purgatory by the Time Pope. Someone should probably take away the Pope's purgatory powers. Episode 5 introduces us to Eliath. Yes, Eliath from Season 1, Episode 5 of Loki. I've seen Deadpool and Wolverine too. If you were waiting for this episode to make that joke, you can rest easy now. Honestly, props for sticking around this long for something so inconsequential. You're probably a Marvel fan though, so with all the love in the world, that's something you're already used to doing. Keep in mind that this is coming from someone who has watched Loki an unhealthy amount of times. I'm not judging, I'm just observing. Like I mentioned before, the void that we find Loki in now is very purgatory-esque. One might go so far as to simply call it purgatory, and I will also do so. On top of that, I think that this is the depths of morbid-mindedness. The Loki variants that survive here are only managing to do just that, survive. Loki says it best himself.
Don't die isn't a plan, it's a general demand of living.
It's a very Sylvie thing for him to say. She was constantly mocking him for having one-step plans on Lamentus, and that lesson seems to have stuck. That connection to Sylvie helps our Loki believe that he can escape this morbid-minded place where every Loki before him has faltered. The flesh and spirit have come a long way from their internal battle, and now that he has found inner peace, he can direct his hope towards something good. After reuniting in a place where nothing good seems to survive, Loki and Sylvie find a moment to themselves to unpack everything that's happened to them so far. Now that the supposed end of the road is in sight, Sylvie wonders if Loki might still be at odds with her.
I know what I did. And I know why I did it. And that's not who I am anymore. I won't let you down.
When she asks if he would take a throne if offered, he declines it. He mocks the fact that he could possibly still be that person after everything he's been through. I think, more than anything, this episode displays for us the benefits of religious experience. The small gathering around a campfire of Mobius and the Lokis that learn to change is an image of the community it can create. None of them are perfect, but they're all learning that it's more important to try than to be. The atheist Loki that we started with would never have allowed anyone this close, much less share a blanket with them. But we've watched him learn over the course of this season that being alone doesn't get you respect. It just gets you alone. Classic Loki's glorious purpose moment is a resolution to this emotional arc. He is the embodiment of a Loki who learned the hard way what being alone gets you. In his final moments, he takes solace in his home and a true glorious purpose that he can be proud of. He isn't embarrassed of his connection to his home anymore, and we can tell by the fact that he creates such a faithful duplication cast of the city that he always loved it. Yet another martyr in the long lines of people who gave their life for others after experiencing the divine. Sylvie and Loki lock hands, finalizing their unity into one as they take their first steps out of purgatory and into heaven or hell. The Citadel at the end of time is many things, but straightforward isn't one of them. Episode 6 is a big one. He who remains created the church. He fostered the dogma, and he decided what was sacred. He knows all, he has seen all, and because of this, he is in control of all. Folks, Loki meets God in this one. Obviously, he's not the God, but he's certainly less human than he appears at first. He who remains is the God of the individual, the very heights of what Loki aspired all his life to become. He's Loki's final boss, and if you think that he's beaten by the end of this season, then you weren't paying attention. He who remains was born just another human, but he ordained himself with a sacred, perhaps even glorious, purpose. He crowned himself the only one who could bear the burden of responsibility, and he made the executive decision to execute infinite timelines to assure that his ideal timeline could survive. He enters the scene eating an apple, and I can't help but feel like this is supposed to parallel the Apple of Eden. The fruit of knowledge of good and evil, which would make man more like God, sitting in the hand of our little tyrant, certainly has implications. This is a jaded view of the divine, not some force outside of us guiding us towards an ideal of any sort, but a selfish man who abused his power in the attempt to prove that he is the only one capable of making the hard decisions. It's called a God complex for a reason, and it's not considered a good thing for an even better reason. When faced with this false god, Loki's previously united front immediately shatters. The flesh is uncertain what to think, but the spirit is still set on the task at hand. Where Loki would like to hear him out, Sylvie just wants to kill the only obstacle she sees to her freedom. He Who Remains presents the same puzzle that most people who actively practice religion find themselves with. The divine and infinite are obviously outside of definition, but if we want a community to gather around this thing we all feel, we have to at least try to define it. Mr. Remains is what we usually get. A man who would be God. Humanity's idea of forces beyond our understanding will almost always become personified. Loki himself is a perfect example of this, but where he was destined to fail, He Who Remains is destined to win. Of course he is. He wrote it to be so.
You never had a chance to defeat me, fool! And you know why?
Because you cheated?
No!
He's reached the end of his rope, though, like all imperfect definitions must. He's tired from the effort of trying to be something he's not, and while he doesn't leave anything to fate, he does allow himself to face whatever consequences may come. After all, he believes himself to be inevitable.
And I just end up right back here anyways. Reincarnation, baby.
Sylvie wins this round because she is determined to be correct, and Loki is still too conflicted to understand what he wants. After one last fleeting moment of connection in the form of a kiss, Loki is cast into the darkness, leaving his spirit behind. He awakes in the TVA, a different man than he was on his first arrival. The church seems to have changed with him. As he stares out into the face of a false god, Loki realizes the weight of what's coming. He's a believer. Now it's time for the next steps. Season 2, and Baptism by Fire. For those not aware of the Christian meaning behind a baptism of fire, it comes from two main places in the Bible. First, John the Baptist, a man known for his baptism rhetoric, says that while he baptizes with water, someone will come after him who baptizes with fire. Then his cousin hits the scene, makes a big fuss, dies, and then comes back, baptizing all his best buds in wind and fire, proving that John was pretty knowledgeable about baptism-related events. This is also known as the Pentecost. Keep that in mind. Pentecostal fire will return in Loki Season 2. A baptism is a cleansing of the soul. When performed with water, the idea is to wash away all of your past misdeeds, but things which have been washed have a habit of needing cleaning again. When performed with fire, a baptism is a definitive incineration of everything that came before. A fresh start. The term has come to mean something a little different from its biblical origins. A baptism by fire today is more likely to be a synonym for a trial by fire, an ordeal that determines your worth by forcing you to alter yourself until you can handle the heat. If you're aware of where Loki arrives by the end of everything, then hopefully you understand how this is his baptism by fire. Episode 1 picks up right where we left off, with Loki making an Attack of the Clones-ass escape from the new TVA he's found himself in.
If you'll excuse me. I hate it when he does that.
After being jarringly ripped from one point of time and space to another, he finally returns to the TVA of his present and finds them embroiled in the tides of change. Mobius and B-15 have been busy while he was meeting with the false god, and they have begun their very own protest to reform the Church of the TVA. That's right. The Protestant Reformation is going as planned. What's interesting is that almost everyone but Sylvie agrees that the TVA is still necessary. They just no longer believe it's serving the needs of the people. The new goal is to create a TVA that actually protects timelines instead of the poor imitation of protection they had been acting out up until that point. Sometimes the dogma becomes the focus of the religion. You have to take a step back and remember that the point was to come together as a community to celebrate and protect this universal connection with something more than yourself. The TVA is taking a couple of big steps back with B-15 at the lead, but there are still those who believe dogma and God are one and the same. General Dox and her Minutemen are our TVA apologists. They believe that the church is an unerring expression of the divine will, and they don't want people with their flawed perceptions and sinful ways to come in and overthink the traditions. If God wants us to stop pruning branches, he'll take away my pruner. While the debates over how to protect time rage on above, Loki finds himself in the base of the TVA speaking with Ouroboros, or OB, about his whole time-slipping problem. He learns that his adventure in the Citadel at the end of time seems to have entangled him with every strand of the timeline. He's reached a form of omnipresence, but he's not yet ready to comprehend, much less accept, the gravity of such power. For now, he rips himself from every other moment back to the present. Conveniently, the only place to do that is the heart of the TVA, the temporal loom. Convenient because their trip to the loom is where they learn that the TVA isn't built for this new idea of protecting time. It was built for one thing and one thing only: protecting the sacred timeline. It doesn't matter what its congregation thinks is really sacred. The church was not constructed to be capable of change. In fact, it was founded to be the exact opposite. In the process of ripping himself from time, Loki sees the future. He notices that Sylvia returns to the TVA, and then he is pruned by an unseen figure against his will. The whole process turns out almost exactly how it needed to. If he had waited much longer, he would have missed his window and been stranded forever. The whole thing seems like fate. Keep that in mind. We will return to our discussions of fate and free will in due time. By the end of the episode, we see the troubles with true reformation of the church. The social structures which originally made it so useful and appealing have become rules of engagement which aren't up for debate. What was once a gathering of people with a singular and noble purpose has become a bureaucratic nightmare which no longer values the people that make it up, but the traditions which were supposed to bring those very people together. Some enforce the old ways almost militantly, believing that their way is what's right for everyone. They will gladly force people to follow the dogma in the hope that one day they will see that it was for the best. Past those stubborn few lies the rotten core of it all. Will reformation be enough to fix an organization founded on the idea of a singular, sacred way of being? Can we retrofit the traditions of old to fit a new understanding of the world? OB is certainly going to try. Episode 2 is our first chance to see the ripples of change. X5, General Dox's right-hand man, defects to the sacred timeline to take back the life that the TVA took from him. His name's Brad now. His response to the collapse of the old world is to turn his back on the church completely. He spent his whole life serving just to find out it was a lie. Why shouldn't he have the right to think of himself for once? Brad is becoming morbid-minded right before our eyes, and we watch him struggle to overcompensate for all the years he spent as part of the church by picking the most individual first job imaginable: actor. Brad has a chance to see how far Loki has come from Season 1. He's no longer the self-centered jerk in the interrogation room. This episode is notable for bringing a new TVA torture method front and center, and also for this incredible-looking slice of key lime pie. I don't care how dangerous that food dye is to my health, I want a slice of that pie. Looking past my clear bias, it seems like this pie is meant to be a visual metaphor for Mobius's whole strategy this season. He refuses to think about the world-shattering truths he's learned since the beginning of the show. Mobius is ignoring a clearly artificial facade in order to continue enjoying his life at the TVA. He justifies his lack of interest in what his life on the timeline might have been like by emphasizing that it's not his life either way. He's afraid that if he knows something good was out there waiting for him, he might get distracted from the mission. If you've met someone who is terrified of anyone asking questions about religion, then you know this line of argument. It can be hard to allow doubt to exist with something as important as religion. If this is your eternal soul at stake, the last thing you want to do is start asking questions and getting so mixed up that you lose sight of this divine presence you once felt. Just keep your head down and do what's asked of you, and surely everything will turn out the way it's supposed to. Based on how he reacts to Brad's jabs, I don't think anyone actually believes that he's free of doubt. He just isn't ready to face a life outside of what he already knows. The familiar may not be the path to religious experience, but sometimes it is a necessary resting place during the endless pilgrimage towards that primal reality. While we let him and Brad stew for a bit, let's check in on what OB's up to.
We're all gonna die! Oh, hey, nice to meet you. We're all gonna die.
Okay, clearly things are not well. In their desperation, Loki and Mobius turn to the aforementioned torture that the TVA is so good at. If you don't get claustrophobic at all watching Brad's panic as the walls close in all around him, just wait until episode 4. The very fact that this thing is lying around is a testament to the cruelty that the TVA is capable of, but what's worse is that they are so willing to fall back into their old patterns the second the new way gets difficult. For all their talk of caring about the lives they hurt, the new TVA is just as prone to psychologically manipulating people to get the outcome they want. That rotten heart at the center of everything is steadily getting worse, and the cosmetic changes around it are already slipping in the panic to prevent total collapse. It's getting clearer by the second that more drastic change will be necessary to fix this place. Say what you want about the old temptations, but they get results. Loki and Sylvie have an awkward reunion in the McDonald's where she now works, and they have the first of many discussions about free will. Sylvie is still under the impression that she won, that once she killed the false idea of God, free will would magically find its way to everyone. She's certainly taken it for herself. Loki is still unconvinced. He has seen a glimpse of the future, and he wholeheartedly believes that it will come to pass without a doubt. Sylvie misunderstands this as an expression of determinism, that the future is already set, and she rejects it. Loki doesn't quite have the words yet to express the new perspective that he's starting to cultivate, so they move on for the time being. After a brief stunt protecting the branches from an attack by General Dox, Sylvie leaves Loki in the wings to sort through yet another sign that the old TVA is still alive and present. It seems the best way to fix it is to go back to the start. To find Miss Minutes and Renslayer, they're going to have to find He Who Remains before he ever dreamed of that title. Episode 3 is Loki's first official mission as a member of the TVA. He has to take some time to watch Mobius at work, and now, instead of looking for a way to escape, he's actually paying attention. This care and focus immediately leads him to another meeting with God, but this one is far less impressive. Before all of the grandiose gadgets and posturing, He Who Remains was Victor Timely, a man. He's gone through a similar, albeit much quicker, deconstruction to Loki's in Season 1. He is fueled by the hubris that he can create pure order from chaos, and that desire is what will lead him to attempting godhood. We can immediately see why he is an imperfect image of God in his dealings with others. When presented with chances to collaborate or experience something outside of himself and his ambitions, he has only one response.
No. I don't do partners.
This is the flaw in the typical human idea of God. He shirks community and wants to do everything for himself. Instead of inspiring more relationships with others, he wants to prove why he's so special. It's individualism at its worst. The self-made man who took whatever he wanted because he was smart and talented enough to do it. The idea is as unhelpful as it is tantalizing, and Victor falls victim to its pitfalls many times in this episode alone. He abandons Renslayer, who wants to be his intellectual equal, only to find that Miss Minutes wants to be his emotional equal. Everywhere Victor looks, he sees someone who needs his help, but he's too focused on keeping up the appearance of a solo act to recognize that he's being offered exactly what he's always wanted. The resources and technology necessary to bring his inventions to life. It almost costs him his life when Sylvie tracks him down and aims to kill him. His only saving grace is his shared belief that the future is not set, that he isn't destined to become He Who Remains simply because that's what has happened before.
That isn't me. That you don't know me. You don't know the heart. The heart I have beating in my chest.
He's discovered through his constant errors that he doesn't have to go it alone anymore. Renslayer refuses to back down, and Sylvie redirects her anger at finding her a fitting punishment. She decides to give her exactly what she wants, a place at the end of time where the man who makes all the choices supposedly resides. Instead of recognizing the corpse in the chair as an omen of what comes from a pursuit of power, Renslayer reawakens Miss Minutes, and together they plan a way to take this power for themselves. At least they've got a little community now, I guess. Revenge probably isn't the best way to seek out an encounter with the divine, even if it is shared with your friends. Episode 4 is the culmination of all the cracks that have formed at the base of the TVA. As everything begins to come together, it's clear that we are racing against time to try and conserve whatever root of good this place was founded on. Tensions rise and old arguments boil over wherever you look. It's evident that we can't ignore the foundations this new TVA is being built on anymore. What once seemed like rock is starting to look a lot more like sand. Sylvie goes off on Mobius for not wanting to know about his life on the timeline. The loom continues to get worse as OB, Casey, and Victor Timely scramble to create a way to increase throughput. Dox is unwilling to accept the new vision for the TVA, and Renslayer returns to take what she believes is hers. If there was ever a time to give up on the hope for a better future for this place, this would be it. Sylvie, recognizing that, tries to make Loki see that she's right about this place. She continues to advocate that it would be easier to just burn it down, and Loki is finally ready to explain what he finds lacking in her perspective. He doesn't disagree, he just argues that there is more to making the right decision than what's easy. Loki counters that trying to fix what's broken is hard. Hope is hard.
That's a lot of hoping, Loki. I didn't have you down for an optimist.
He has had a religious experience and entered the fullness of a morbid-minded approach to life. He agrees that there is evil everywhere, even in the TVA, but he has seen in his time spent with the people that something unmistakably good exists at the core of it all. Behind that rotten heart is the seed of a better future for everyone, and he isn't ready to give up for what's easiest. This is the benefit of his newfound belief. Loki has gone from a hedonist to an optimist. On top of that, he has learned to accept the burden of his role in life. Whenever he talked about being a god before, it was always with a hint of superiority. He got an ego boost from the idea that he was the only person able to manage the power that came along with being in charge. Now that he is starting to see the bigger picture of what a god can be, he sounds far more sober when he reminds Sylvie of what they are.
It's up to us to do better than he who remains.
Sounds like whatever we do, we're playing God.
We are gods.
With a new understanding of godhood as a responsibility and not an excuse, Loki and Sylvie rush to stop Renslayer from taking control of the TVA. Loki runs through the halls until he hears a familiar sound, the ringing of a telephone. He approaches slowly and sees himself from the past trying to fix the time slipping. Suddenly, this moment of fate has transformed. It is no longer an expression of events unfolding how they were always supposed to. It was an active choice that he made to prune himself in order to save his own life, but also to enact what he already knows will happen. It was always a choice. Cause and effect were just reversed. Does this mean that Sylvie was wrong? Was this moment always meant to come to pass? And if so, is free will still real? Free will is kind of a strange concept. It seems straightforward at first, but the more you try to pin it down, the more you realize that you can't even know you have it without ruining it in the process. It has to be kept vague to work. If a divine force came down and told you that you have free will, that you have to partake in making decisions for your life, then it robs you of a choice. Whether you like it or not, believing that everything has already been decided is a form of choice, and if you told someone they have free will, you're taking that from them. Both answers have to be true in order for free will to exist in its purest form. Every seemingly ambiguous truth about the world reinforces your right to choose. The difference between free will and determinism isn't fact, it's perspective. In order to understand what I mean by this, we have to take a detour into a little tale called Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. You may know this story by another name, Arrival. There are definitely some differences between the film and source material, but the overall point stays the same, so assume there will be spoilers for both if you care. The gist is that aliens called heptapods appear on Earth one day with unknown goals, and a linguist is recruited to try and learn their language to communicate. After some time, she finds that they perceive time differently than humans. Where we understand time as a series of sequential events, they understand it as a simultaneous occurrence. As a linguist learns how to write in the heptapod's language, it begins to alter the way that she thinks. When she pictures their writing in her head, she becomes briefly unmoored from time, and she starts to see things like they do. The physical universe was a language with a perfectly ambiguous grammar. Every physical event was an utterance that could be parsed in two entirely different ways, one causal and the other teleological. Both valid, neither one disqualifiable, no matter how much context was available. She understands time to be like an optical illusion. Once you know that there are two images in the picture, you can perceive them both, but it will always be one at a time. Even with a full understanding of the different ways to experience events, you still have to see it as either causal or teleological. The important thing to note is that neither option is right or wrong. They're just two different lenses. One favors free will and the other favors determinism, but even that understanding isn't completely true. Freedom isn't an illusion. It's perfectly real in the context of sequential consciousness. Within the context of simultaneous consciousness, freedom is not meaningful, but neither is coercion. It's simply a different context, no more or less valid than the other. Sylvie's perception is that if Loki thinks that an event in the future is guaranteed to occur, then he believes that they have no control over their lives. In reality, Loki thinks it will occur not because it was written, but because it is the natural fallout of their free choices. Loki had a moment of simultaneous consciousness where he saw beyond cause and effect to the timeline as a whole, but his observation of this moment didn't cause it to happen. It was still his choice to walk up and prune himself. Even when He Who Remains was in charge, he couldn't force people to act however he wanted. Instead, he built the TVA to ensure that only one set of causes and effects would ever come to pass. The people on the sacred timeline were completely free to act how they always would have. It was only the variants who had their free will taken by force. This might seem like a lot for one scene about a pretty common time travel trope, but it'll be important for the remainder of this season. Loki's time-slipping powers are equivalent to the way that the heptapod's language affected the linguist's brain. When he's connected to every moment in time, he has the ability to start seeing things from a new perspective, and it's this perspective that allows him to find the one thing that only a Loki could, a way out of this mess that he's made. After that little diatribe into the nature of free will, you might be hoping for something a little lighthearted. Unfortunately, all I have for you is Victor Spaghetti. All hope seems to be lost. The kernel of good couldn't shine through the heart in time, and the TVA unravels around them as Loki realizes that all the hope in the world couldn't save them from this fate. Episode 5 is about peeling back one last layer to Loki. Now that he's started to see the benefits of working with his community, he has to learn the difference between serving them for their sake and serving them for his. Loki's fight-or-flight reflex kicks into high gear, and his time-slipping comes back with a vengeance. He doesn't have control over where he is taken, but it seems to be tied to the people in his community. He sees Casey in Alcatraz, Mobius in a power sports store, B-15 in a doctor's office, and OB in a lab. Each of them is living the lives intended for them on the sacred timeline. None of them know who he is. Loki is forced to face the fact that they all have lives outside of the church. He desperately believed that the TVA was necessary to protect everything, but it's gone, and they're still here. Everything isn't perfect, but they're fine. He's not ready to accept that yet, so he continues to look for a way to get back to the moment the loom exploded. He needs the TVA to be necessary, or all his new healthy relationships are gone with it. Obi's alternate self seems to be the most willing and able to help Loki with his mission. He thinks Obi's day job as a theoretical physicist will be the one to help him, but it's his experience as an author that puts the pieces together. Don't forget, despite everything that has happened, this is still a story. It doesn't follow the rules of science. It follows the rules of fiction. Obi explains that in science, the questions to ask are what and how, but in fiction, the question should be why. Purpose and intent are what drive a story forward, so if Loki can figure out why he needs to get the team back together so badly, he should be able to do it. Loki still isn't ready to face his true intent, so his why falls flat. He says that he wants to find everyone to save the TVA and prevent the destruction of everything, but we know at this point that there's more at stake than that. Loki may be concerned about the variance of He Who Remains, but that's not the main reason that he wants this specific group of people back. It takes yet another debate with Sylvie to break through this final layer of his shell. Sylvie thinks that with the TVA gone, she can truly rest easy, so she isn't going to just drop everything to save it again. She sees through his illusion and asks him what he really wants. With the TVA gone, he could go anywhere and do anything, yet he is choosing to waste his time in trying to save it? Why? This is certainly not what the Loki we met at the start of Season 1 would be doing. It takes a few tries, but he finally gives in and admits that what he really wants is his friends back. His community became a comfort for him, and now that it's gone, he just wants everything to go back to normal. If you've ever had a falling out with friends, you know the feeling. It's a desperate need to undo just one bad decision to prevent a lifetime of regret. He doesn't want to fix the church because he cares about the TVA. He wants to fix it so that he can feel safe again. With a new understanding of his why, Loki can see the really human side of himself. He's being selfish, but that doesn't make his decision wrong. He just can't lie to himself anymore. He wants to fix things because he believes that he was a part of something good and beautiful. There's no need to justify it with some existential threat. Saving relationships is a sacred enough mission even when it is a bit selfish. The threads of time once again unravel all around him, but this time, Loki understands what he has to do. He can't run from his mistakes, but he might be able to face them now. He takes one last look at his friends, and he time slips back to the end of episode 4. He has seen the whole story. He knows the why. Now it's time to rewrite it. Episode 6 of Season 2 is the second one to be titled Glorious Purpose. The first was episode 1 of Season 1. In many ways, we have come full circle. This episode is a return to the reflections on what has come before, but instead of being a passive observer, Loki is going to take an active role in fixing his mistakes. The first thing to fix is all the stalling. Loki speedruns his last few minutes, and then hours, and then days to try and beat the temporal radiation. With a few centuries of effort, he's able to perfect the retrofitting project and fix the single-minded design at the heart of the TVA. Unfortunately, this isn't a problem you can scale for. The loom was built to manage one strand of time, but the multiverse is infinite. He was never going to be able to fix the machine because it was built to exclude. The foundations were always rotten. Nothing built on them can last. With this terrible realization, Loki returns to the next major regret in his life, his fight with Sylvie at the end of time. If he can convince Sylvie not to kill He Who Remains, then maybe they can find a new way out of this mess. That's a big if, and it quickly becomes clear that Sylvie's determination has left him with two choices: kill her or watch her kill He Who Remains. His next gambit is to hold a conference with the only other man who knows what this godlike perspective of time is like. He speaks with He Who Remains with a newfound understanding of how tedious it can be to try and create the perfect chain of events. They have a new respect for each other, and this is the first time that Loki approaches him as a complete equal. He is no longer in fear of this false image of God. Instead, he understands the pressures and circumstances that created him. He has gone through many of them himself at this point. With empathy, they try and come to an understanding about what needs to be done for the sake of everything. He Who Remains holds fast that his solution is the only one that can work. The multiverse needs someone sitting in the big chair, watching over everything, and making the hard decisions. He's running the world's largest and most messed up version of the trolley problem, and he is firmly on the side of pulling the lever. Loki knows that this option isn't good enough, but where he faltered before, now he is finally learning to put his strengths to use. He used to spend his whole life looking for an escape plan, so who better to take a look at this false dichotomy and see it for what it is? He still has hope that there is a better option beyond what He Who Remains could find, but to do that, he has to face a hard truth. What Loki is doing here is a bit of a dream come true for the morbid-minded person. He can go back in time and personally eradicate the evils that have haunted him. He can make it so that he never had to face the realities of the world. It's so tempting to believe that if he could just fix his mistakes, then he would be happy. But to live the perfect life doesn't mean that life would be perfect. Your mistakes are one with you because they are the direct consequences of your decisions. If you don't make those mistakes, you don't become the person that learns not to make those choices. A significant portion of your personality comes from the choices you've made in your life and the fallout of those decisions. You could go back and tweak things all you like, but you would only be robbing your past self of free will. At the beginning of this season, Loki thought that the only thing he needed to fix everything was time.
I just wish I had tried harder. I wish I'd had more time.
Now that we're at the end, he has all the time in the world. The more he tries to go back and change the decisions that have already been made, the more he sees that this is the wrong way to use free will. He is imposing his will on others. This is not how they would have acted if he didn't intervene, and we know that because we've seen what their choices lead to. So if the options are save the world at the cost of free will or watch it all unravel, what would you choose? Would a world without freedom really be saved, or is that just a different form of death? Despite his growing power and knowledge, he seems more helpless than ever. He Who Remains was a dead end. His only advice from one god to another is to make the hard choice. Faced with impossible options, Loki asks his friends for guidance. Where the old Loki would have thrown a tantrum, this one turns to the relationships he's cultivated and trusts that the people he cares about will tell him what he needs to hear, even if it's scary. First up is Mobius. He picks their interview in the Time Theater before the relationship has had a chance to form. There's no time for Mobius' sentimentality. He needs a Mobius from a time when they weren't close enough to pull punches. A Mobius who was willing to call him a mischievous scamp. A Mobius who doesn't think twice about pruning branches. He wastes no time in asking the big question.
How do you choose who lives and who dies?
There's no comfort. You just choose your burden.
Mobius responds with a parable. There's a hunter who goes to prune a variant that will cause countless deaths unless he is stopped. They arrive at the right place, but the wrong time, and when they find the variant, he's still just a kid. The hunter hesitates, and his partner has to step in and finish the job. He tells Loki that the moral of the story is that purpose is more burden than glory. There is no easy way out, and no matter what you do, if the decision is important, then someone is going to get hurt. We've gone over this many times now. This is the morbid-minded dilemma. You live in a cruel world, and you have to find a way to keep trying to make good choices every day despite it all. There is no comfort to be found at the TVA. Religion isn't always a solution. Sometimes it's work. You're faced with constant reminders of the evils that exist all around, and you have to put your fears aside to think about something outside of yourself. You have to choose to trust in and care about people who you know are flawed and capable of really bad things. There's no comfort to be found here. You just choose your burdens. Once again, Loki hasn't found the answer he's looking for, but he is closer to understanding his purpose. The last stop on his journey through time is Sylvie. He chooses to meet her in the alternate OB's lab right before the world falls apart. This is a Sylvie who has spent the most possible time with him, and she will be able to give him the most honest answer to his question. It's the same debate they've had throughout this season, the one that started in the Citadel. What's worse, to rob people of free will in order to protect something, or to fight for freedom even if it means everything will almost certainly be destroyed? Loki wants to know what good free will is to the dead. Sylvie wants to know what good living is to those who aren't free. They once again come to Sylvie's steadfast belief that it's okay to destroy things. Loki has fought her since they first met over her brute force approach to everything. He refuses to believe that it is okay to just destroy something, but he could never quite voice why until now. As he starts to piece together what he needs to do to save everything, a sad relief washes over his face.
Sometimes it's okay to destroy something.
If there's a hope that you can replace that thing.
His baptism is completed, so he returns to the moment when everything went wrong, right before the temporal loom is destroyed. We are once again moments away from disaster, but he is not the same person that watched it all burn once before. It's extremely important that he barely changes anything after all his time spent trying to rewrite the story. There was never anything wrong with the story, he just needed to see it all again to understand his place in it. He knows now what kind of God he wants to be, and this time, he wants that title not for himself, but for everyone else. He walks through the temporal radiation, and it has no effect on his body. He is no longer a man. He has found peace with everything outside of himself, and he knows that his purpose is not to rule, but to serve. Loki has always used illusions to create the image of himself as a god, but now time has stripped everything else away to reveal his true nature. Beneath it all, under the layers of illusions and deceit and fear, was a god all along. The horns and cape are no longer there to serve his vanity. They are proof that he has finally become what he always pretended to be. This new Loki effortlessly dismantles the heart of the TVA. The church doesn't need it anymore. It was always just a machine meant to lead them astray. With the multiverse grasped in his hands, Loki walks to the end of time as his new self, baptized in fire, not water. There is no trace of the old sins. That isn't to say that he is a completely different person. While he has spent 2 seasons learning not to fall into his old patterns, he has also learned not to run from his past. He was afraid to be vulnerable and show love for his home, but as he breathes life back into the multiverse, it takes the shape of Yggdrasil, the world tree. In this case, the many worlds tree. After everything he has endured, this is still Loki, and as he achieves what he always wanted, he can't help but think of home. We immediately see the ripples that this one choice causes all around him. He led by example, and with the old heart discarded, the TVA is finally able to reform into something capable of protecting people the way it was meant to. Capable of good. B-15, Casey, and OB have started the process of change for the better. They're rewriting the rules, literally changing the handbook on how time should be protected. Most importantly, Mobius has finally been convinced to face his fears and see what was waiting for him on the sacred timeline. Sylvie joins him, and they watch what his life could have been like. For the first time since he can remember, Mobius is free from the TVA. All his time spent in belief and service never really had a context because he didn't have a life outside of the church. Like a healthy-minded person seeing the beautiful mess that is the real world for the first time, he just takes it all in. Now that he sees what it is he was protecting, he can appreciate the divine more fully. He can allow time to pass. Watching it all from the big chair is Loki, the god who was willing to make the hardest choice. If you hadn't seen the process he took to get here, you might consider this a tragic ending. Lady Sif was right all along. He's alone, and he always will be. Instead, he sits at the end of time with the knowledge that he will never truly be alone, and he smiles. He chose his burden. He has found his purpose. He knows the purpose of glory. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that this religious reading of the show was directly intentional. I don't think everyone making Loki just sat down and decided that we were going to watch a god learn to have religion. That doesn't change the fact that it's what we got in the end, though. Death of the author is a concept that's been brought up too many times on YouTube for me to ever mention it for more than a second, so I won't be using it as my get out of jail free card. Instead, I'll opt for the much simpler explanation that Loki ended up being about religious experience because that's what happens when you center your narrative around glorious purpose. We talked an age ago about how the fruits of religious experience are often about finding a purpose outside of yourself. We also talked about how glory has a strange connotation when it relates to purpose. Glory typically relates to success in battle or overcoming some adversary. You get glory through competition and rivalry, not working together with others. They might be there, but they're there for your purpose, not some shared one. This is the nature of stories. No matter how many characters you include, they almost always come out with individual goals. We rarely, if ever, tell stories about communities, only the people in them. After all, a protagonist is a person, not a people. Loki's original glorious purpose fits this idea well. He wants to rule over Midgard to prove to himself and his father that he's worthy of being both god and king. The army he wields is a literal hive mind with no emotional arc outside of making New York not exist anymore. A noble cause. What moved me so much about this show is the way that he shifts this perspective. It's subtle at first, but every time he makes a new connection or allows himself to get more and more vulnerable, you can see the change making him a better person. Season 1 is about taking away his glorious purpose, making him disillusioned with it entirely. Classic Loki and his constant sneering at the idea are the mission statement. We tear down Loki's worldview so that we can build up something better in Season 2. That something better is still purpose, but the glory has taken a backseat to burden. He's doing what's best for everyone else, even if it means facing his deepest fears. He's seen through the allure of glory for what it really is. The purpose of glory is self-gratification. It's the story we tell ourselves to justify doing whatever it takes to feel important. Loki's self-prescribed purpose was an excuse to indulge in his ego without having to get tangled up in empathy. His conversations with Mobius and Sylvie are a big part of making the decision conscious, but Loki realizes what his true purpose is before he ever leaves the Citadel. He Who Remains might not have taught him the lesson he expected, but he did pave the way for the ending. In the final episode of Loki, the God of Mischief stands before the man who taught him the fear of God and quotes 2 lines from T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding. You can see in his eyes that this is the moment he realizes he can't just rewrite the story.
We die with the dying. We're born with the dead.
I want to read you a longer excerpt so you have some context for what he's saying here. Every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning. Every poem an epitaph, and any action is a step to the block, to the fire, down the sea's throat, or to an illegible stone. And that is where we start. We die with the dying. See, they depart, and we go with them. We are born with the dead. See, they return and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. The poem is about cycles. It's about the constant ebb and flow between life and death, ice and fire, choice and fate. It's about Pentecostal fire, the baptism that does out with the old to make room for the new. I told you it would be returning. It contends with the futility of doing anything when a moment seems as long as a century when compared to infinity. The blooming of a rose and the life of a yew tree are but a moment compared to it all. On the other side of these cycles and this futility, we find this sentiment. So, while the light fails, on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now in England. With the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. He Who Remains sees the world with logic and logic abundantly. He has spent countless lifetimes in search of a way to keep everyone safe from destruction. His answer is to ensure only one safe world can survive. For someone who has lived the long term, his solution is remarkably short-sighted. Sylvie's response is equally reactionary but emotional. Kill the man at the top. Cut the head off the snake, and its venom will have no more victims. She should have read about Jormungandr's last act of defiance at Ragnarok. Even in death, the venom retains its bite. Loki needed 2 seasons and centuries of time to reach the only conclusion there is. Logic and emotion aren't separate things. They're parts of a whole. We've already discussed this at length regarding Ratatouille, but it bears repeating. When contending with infinite timelines, the only mindset to have is that history is now. This moment is all we can protect. It is holy. The song that plays as Loki sits on his throne watching over the multiverse is literally titled History is Now. They weren't trying to hide this. Loki's final choice doesn't guarantee safety or security. It isn't the most logical or emotional choice. It's the choice of the highest quality. It put the emphasis on giving every world a chance to exist and be experienced. Loki gets the big horns and flowing cape he's always dreamed of, not because he took it for himself, but because he finally decided to be a real god. Not the idealized guy who sits in the clouds eating grapes and living in paradise, but the patient observer who gives the present a chance to be experienced. The present is divine. It is the only place where experience can truly happen. The past is a memory of experiences had. The future is potential for new experience, but only the present can be participated in. The true end goal of religious experience is a drawing towards the present, an experience of the now so complete that you can see everything that is happening simply for what it is. Loki's ascendance to the throne is literally an experience of infinite timelines worth of present moments. I don't know if you're religious, but I'm assuming if you're still here, you're at least amenable to the idea or nice enough to power through despite the difference of opinion. Either way, I think you might like to hear one last story. We end, as all good things should, at the beginning, with the story of an outcast and his deeds, both good and evil. You may at times feel the desire to brand him a villain, but things won't be so simple. This is the story of you. This is the story of me. This is the path we all walk despite our fears that it was paved long before we set foot on it. The road is long, and the story can only show us so much of it. Still, we listen to the story and we hope for guidance, for some sign of where to turn and where to stay steadfast. We seek some form of companion on this journey, and the story tells us that this road is not one that we walk alone. Breathe in through your nose and taste the air. Breathe out through your mouth and feel your exhalation join everything around you. Look around and realize that right here, right now, you are a part of it all. You aren't alone on this road. You never have been. The story might tell you that this is God. It might tell you that this is divine. It might say that this is just other people. Whatever it may be, you know it to be good. Seek it out again whenever you like. It is always here waiting for you. But for now, take your next step forward, away from this story and towards the next. The beginning that comes from this ending. Look behind you if you would like to see the kind, burdened eyes of Loki watch you go. The god of mischief. The devil who found God. The man who learned his true purpose. An example for us all. Another story for your journey. Carry it with you if it eases your burdens, or cast it aside if it only adds to them. Whatever you do now is yours to decide, for this story is finished. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Everyone, gather around the fire. It's about to start again.